Which would you rather fight? A horse-sized duck or 50 duck-sized horses? I promise this will make sense. Just discuss amongst yourself. Which would you rather fight? Just shout it out. Anybody care to share? Which would you rather fight and why?
I definitely go for the horses because I don't know, ducks get pretty violent and if you try to over the duck, it's game over.
Okay.
But I feel like the horses will be skittish.
Okay. Great. Horses are flight animals. Horses, so they like to run away. That is a common response I get. Is horses are quote puntable, or what I've heard recently is horses are eatable. I do like asking this question. In working with the military and working with civilian populations, I do get different answers. When I ask this question to the military and folks at CCLD, what do you anticipate would be the response on why the military folks don't want to fight the duck? Yeah, it can operate in multiple domains. It can fly, it can swim, it can run. Horses can just come at you in one direction. Also, as somebody who has horses, if I walked out the hallway and turned right and 50 small horses came at me, I would go, oh. If a horse-sized duck was coming down that hallway, I would be terrified. But what's interesting is what I get from our civilian counseling students in our master's program is that ethical dimension is, well, why do I have to fight any of them? Horses were one of the first animals we domesticated as humans. So why can't I just domesticate 50 horses? And now I have a horde of small horses. And so kind of that third dimension. So just to warm you up, gets you started thinking about ethics in relation to the principles of the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative. And for those that said you would kick the horse, I would agree, I'd probably do the same, but is that ethical based off those principles? So we are going to dive into another brief discussion. For those educators in the room, you may know this. So for the students in the room, you may not. But how do we know what we know? How do we know what we know? You know something in your mind is fact. How do we know that? So you were taught through your family system.
What actually happens to us?
Okay, something that happened to us firsthand.
By observing.
Observing, okay.
What we're taught.
Over time. Oh, go ahead.
Reflection.
Reflection. Students, how do you know what you know? Other than the fact somebody talked to you for an hour and a half in your class. It can be proven. So we would call that through research. So we've researched that, we've tested that. Okay. So for the educators in the room, and Corey will know this, we call this epistemology or theory of knowledge. And so these are the ways in which we know things. I heard observation, informal observation, selective observation. Informal observation is I saw that happen out my window. Selective observation means I saw it out the window and maybe I chose to observe it and maybe I chose to ignore it. Overgeneralization. Let's say I saw a duck peck somebody once. Now I assume all ducks like to quack and peck people. That's overgeneralization. Authority. Somebody like me telling you something and you ascribe authority to me and then you believe everything I say. Don't. And research methods. You know, can we test something and is it provable? Why is this relevant to ethics? And in this case, character development and leadership. I'm sure everybody's familiar with Carol Dweck. Intelligence is malleable, growth mindset, fixed mindset. But my question to you is, can we build character and how? And is character malleable? Thoughts?
I would totally think character is malleable.
Okay.
That's what the military training is, I think, partly about forging character to experience, to train.
Yeah, possibly. It's mission essential. We have to believe that character is malleable and that we can coach character to put people in positions of leadership within the military. Other thoughts there?
Well, in kids with like young children, you try and build their character to be the people that you hope that they'll grow up to be. So
Sure.
try and put good values.
I posit that yes, character is malleable. Research tells us that character is malleable. We talked about how we know what we know, informal observation through things like our family. Our family teaches us things that then we in turn internalize as values and inform our character and inform our ethical decision making. So that can start at a very young age. So if we know that, if we believe that, then we know this happens over time. And does it ever end? So a little bit about programming. Again, for the CCLD folks, you know this. I work in a couple programs at the College of Ed with Department of Counseling and Human Services. We have two programs that I'm going to be hitting on primarily today. We have our Air Officer Commanding cohort, which is a master's degree in leadership and counseling. And these are individuals who are current majors within the operational Air Force across all career fields. So we have missileers, flyers, people from medical professions, you name it. And they are selected through a process to come to USAFA and assume squadron command of a squadron of cadets. Prior to assuming squadron command of cadets, they take a year-long master's degree with us. And so they're exposed to counseling theory, counseling labs, a variety of things here. So we start with self-understanding and self-reflection, understanding oneself. Then we move through virtues, values, principles, ethics. I teach 3 classes within this program, which is what I really love. I teach leadership and character development, which is their first of 3 leadership courses. I teach their initial developmental counseling lab, where they're actually in counseling labs learning clinical counseling skill. And then the third is ethics and character development. And so it's kind of this confluence of things that influence leadership. And our second program there is our Academy Military Trainer Program. And that's a certificate program where they come to us for 4 weeks. And these are the NCOs that work underneath the AOCs, the squadron commanders. In that process, we also work with the group commanders. So these are colonels. And so these are colonels that oversee the AOCs. So we work across the sequence here. We also partner with Department of Faculty and Behavior and Leadership. So that's our colleagues in the department up there, specifically Dr. Metcalf and Dr. Kelly in DFEL. Those are our partners up there. And we program our curriculum, vertically align our curriculum to go basically cadet through squadron commander. So we're using very similar language. So we kind of work our AOCs and our AMTs through this process, and they're currently in their final semester, which is their field work and a variety of other classes that involve coaching, multicultural counseling, things like that. So they're actually getting to apply all of this before they assume that command. And for many of them, this is actually their first command. There are 22 of these individuals, and we only have 1 that has been a prior commander, so this is their first command. And when we think about the leaders that we've had in the past, we want them to have all these skills. We want them to have interpersonal communication ability. We want them to have high emotional intelligence, but we also want them to know the job, right? We want them to be able to actually function and get that skill set. So we bring all those together. So how do we start? We think about ethical decision-making, developing leaders and leaders of character, which is the terminology of USAFA. Developing leaders of character is the goal, is the mission. And so how do we do this in the leaders that develop other leaders? So we start before they even come here with onboarding. So a high level of self-reflection. So it's an emotional intelligence assessment, leadership forecast series. If you're familiar, is anybody familiar with the Hogan Leadership Forecast Series? Okay, well, I CCLD books, I know you're familiar with that. Of Fortune 500 companies, the majority of Fortune 500 companies for their leaders and high potential soon-to-be leaders either use the Hogan Leadership Forecast Series or the Clifton Strengths Inventory or both. And so we get, they're exposed to the Leadership Forecast Series. Hogan 360 is we collect all information from people you've worked with in the past, previous leaders, previous supervisors, colleagues, and those you've led, bring all that information together and provide coaching around that, helping them understand and coaching. We have the Mesquite, which is the Myers-Salovoy assessment, Big 5, the VIA, which is actually, I'll talk a little bit about more in a minute, but that's some values and character assessments out of Wake Forest. We do some attachment style information. And then we're currently in the middle of the EQI 360. So they actually get information from everybody around you. So how do you develop self-knowledge, self-awareness to be an ethical leader, ethical decision maker, and a leader of character? You start with reflection. You have to know all this stuff. How do I perceive myself and how do others perceive me? And more often than not, those things do not match. We often overestimate our abilities in a variety of areas. There's 2 areas kind of nationally we overestimate our abilities in. Does anybody have any guesses there? What 2 areas do we overestimate our abilities in? One of them is something we all deal with every day, and we overestimate our ability. Driving. We all overestimate our driving ability. The other is leadership. So those are the 2 areas we overestimate our abilities in pretty often. I think I'm an okay driver. I would not say I'm a good driver. I definitely know that as a Coloradoan, the speed limit is 85 on the interstate. It's not 75. If it's 75, you're going too slow, and that makes me not a good driver. So I'll accept that. And so in the process of this, we engage in coaching and reflection. So not only do you get this information, but you sit down with faculty and we engage in coaching. What does this actually mean? How does it influence my leadership? And how does it influence my decision making? And then counseling skill. Obviously, we're helping those individuals who maybe have been used to dropping bombs or launching missiles, actually engage in higher levels of emotional intelligence, human connection. That's what we call the human domain of leadership. So this is kind of a graphic representation of what we do. This says AOC knowledge, practice, and application. We also do this with the AMTs. So we're kind of bringing together a multidisciplinary approach to leadership and leadership development. So that's kind of the history. And so what I love about this job and the project I'm currently working on, where we revamp some of the curriculum in our Academy Military Trainer program, is it brings together ethics, leadership, counseling skill, and coaching, executive coaching. And so all of those things together. And so we're going to start with a brief activity. It only takes a couple seconds. If you have a device or phone, when I tested it, it does work on your phone. If it doesn't, please let me know. I'm just going to have you go to that short URL there. This is a brief values sort. You can disregard all the information at the top and scroll down to the bottom with the colored boxes. And you're simply just tasked with identifying a value that is either a priority or not a priority for you on a scale. And you're dragging and dropping. So this is actually an activity that we do both in AOC programming, but I teach career development, career counseling. And this is something we typically do with hard copies like this, and you would have spread out on a table. For the sake of our folks online, I'm doing a digital version that's much more abbreviated. As you're doing that, you'll notice some of these are aligned with DFEI principles. You'll see integrity in there, accountability, a variation of respect. So looking at both some principle-based ethics, some principles, some values and virtues. So for the sake of time, I think there's only 24. Like I said, this is usually done with actual bits of paper because it's a little more hands-on, a little more tangible. In this case, there's actually 100 in this little packet, and then what you did is 24. And so on day one of work with our handing cohort, I have them go through this, and they have to come up with a cohort set of values, a cohort set of virtues, and identify as a group of 22 people with agreement, the values that they will carry on for a year that align with their annual squadron commander. So the current cohort, I will tell you, this is not a fast process. After some time landed on genuineness, unity, and growth as core values for their group, for their 22. And then they had to identify what is an obstacle to them engaging in and maintaining those virtues, those values over the course of a year. And they landed on competing priorities. So it is hard to engage genuine dialogue if there is conflict that's not addressed. That's a tenet and principle of counseling. We have to address conflict. And so this is something that we use as a starting point, foundation. So we talk about how do values influence, how do virtues influence character. When we're put in positions where our character is challenged, we're forced to make ethical decisions. We orient ourselves back to values. We orient ourselves back to virtues. So some of these are organizational values. In the military, there's obviously values and virtues assigned that are determined by the military. In the case of USAFA, I will not lie, steal, or cheat, or tolerate anybody who does. Those are key facets of character development, of developing leaders of character. So when placed in these situations, you go back to your values and virtues, both personal and organizational. At times, our personal values conflict with organizational values. So a little bit of moral philosophy. I'm not going to spend too much time on this just because we had some tech issues in time. But we move from understanding values and virtues and principles into moral philosophy. What are the foundations of moral decision-making, ethical decision-making, dating back to the ancient philosophers? So we go all the way back up to current. I always like to throw a spot quote: "The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few." Duty-based theories. This is pretty well aligned with what those in the military have to or get to engage with is duty of service. And then some agent-centered theories. In the case of Carol Gilligan, we bring in feminist and care ethics. We understand that most ethicists and most moral philosophers started from a place of justice, which is a very male-oriented orientation. And so Carol Gilligan came about to prioritize an ethic of care, which is more seen in females. And so balancing those two of an ethic of care and an ethic of justice, because as a squadron commander, you are engaging in the development of young leaders, of young adults, and you are engaging in some duty-based ethics and duty-based frameworks because you're functioning within the moral. So then we dive into some moral psychology, bringing in a bunch of different social sciences. So we start off with moral sensitivity, moral reason and judgment, moral motivation, moral character. As a jumping off point for that, we introduced the concept of moral potency. Is anybody familiar with the concept of moral potency, aside from my CCLD folks? Okay. So in the case of moral potency, there are three facets of moral potency. When you hear the term moral potency, what springs to mind? Yeah, it influences your decisions. Absolutely. When we think about this from a leadership framework, If I am in a position within a leadership hierarchy, maybe I'm not on top, but I'm somewhere in that structure. And there's something that's happening that may be unethical, or maybe I don't agree with, or maybe is compromising, going against my values, organizational values. We have to start with a place of moral ownership. Is this moral issue? Do I have a role in it? Do I own this? Am I involved in it? Then we go to moral efficacy. Do I believe I can influence this? Do I believe I can influence this organizational decision, this organizational change? I mean, do I have the moral courage to act? Do I have the moral courage? So I may know I own the issue. I may believe I can affect change, but I may choose not to act. And so when we look at organizational failures, and in the case of USAFA, this is introduced to cadets through the B-52 incident at Fairchild. But basically, how do unethical decisions, how do they get made? Fairchild, I'm not going to dive too much into it. A B-52 crashed because a guy was flying by the seat of his pants. It's intentionally not embedded in this because it's graphic. But think about, I'm going to ask you in your own organizations, either past or present, when you may have witnessed something, or you may have seen something where you may have chosen to act, not act, or you saw somebody else in your leadership structure that acted, not acted. And did they choose to do that for any one of these reasons? If we think about sales, for example, and I'm going to talk kind of sideways because I'm not in marketing or business. If I am seeing a fellow salesperson engage in dishonest marketing strategies or sales to an individual, like this widget can grow my hair back, that's not going to happen. And I am a fellow salesperson. I know our product does not do that. Our product does not grow people's hair back. Our widget does not grow people's hair back. I know I'm involved in that because I'm part of this organization. And that misrepresentation of our product may impact me. I may feel that I have the ability to impact change and get this person to stop doing this if I report this behavior to my supervisor or my manager. I may choose not to do this because I may be fearful of my job security. Okay. Or I may feel I have the courage to do something, but maybe it's not something I'm involved in. Okay. So this is kind of a starting principle. So we move from values, moral philosophy, moral psychology, and into moral potency. Okay, everybody's familiar with the trolley problem. I'm not going to dive into this. I'm not going to make you talk about it, but there's a reason we don't cover all of moral philosophy. So we do like to have a little bit of fun as we teach these things. So ethical decision-making terms that our students are exposed to, obligatory, things that kind of are required to do, duty-based ethics. So it is obligatory that we care for children. Impermissible, things you definitely shouldn't do under any circumstance. Murder, for example, this is an interesting dynamic when we work with the military, because that's part of the mission is keeping the country safe, and sometimes that does involve harming others. Permissible, it's ethically neutral. What is neither right nor wrong? And so when we look at ethics, we in this world we operate in the gray, and in counseling we always operate in the gray. And on day 1, day 2 of working with Air Officer Commanding folks, the level of discomfort in operating in the gray is fantastic because they're sweating through their shirts, and I really enjoy it. And so that'd be something like plastic surgery is not right or wrong. There may be some cultural norms around that. So it's permissible. And then supererogatory, going above and beyond. So these are the type of things individuals receive things like the Medal of Honor for, is going above and beyond the call of duty. In the case of the civilian world, this may be helping somebody across the street. So we begin to understand the scale of decision making. We go through some ethical decision-making models. How many folks are familiar with general ethical decision-making models? I know in the business world. So we have some ethical decision-making models from the American Counseling Association, the International Coaching Federation, social work, some other former models. For our CCLD folks, you're familiar with this one. This actually came from an F-16 pilot in the decision-making process of air combat. So this is a very simplified version of what we do in our ethical decision-making. These are much more structured. So observe, orient, decide, act, and then re-engage in that cycle. So once you've engaged in an ethical decision-making process as a leader, you're not done. It's cyclical in nature. So we go through all of those. So next, I'm going to just ask you to watch this video and just observe the characters, make some general observations in reference to values and character.
No one was helping anyone.
Okay, yeah. So some self-interest.
Very chaotic.
Chaotic.
They acted very, no leadership.
No leadership.
Well, and the guy who initiated
the goal was worthy, but the approach was completely unethical.
The road to hell is paved with good intentions. Yeah. Anything else? Anything else you observed?
The only one who helped anyone was the woman who helped Cat,
Uh,
sort of.
So this is just a general exercise. You can really use anything like this. But this is where we introduce positive psychology. So psychology by nature is problem-centered. Psychology started figuring out what was wrong. What's wrong with individuals? What's diagnosable? There's literally a manual this thick called the DSM-5 of all the ways in which we're messed up. And so that's kind of the history of psychology. So positive psychology introduces what's going right, what helps us thrive. So this exercise is pretty typical. When I do this with undergrads, graduate students, adults, it generally plays out the same way. We identify what's wrong. We identify what's missing, what's negative, what people did incorrectly. Very rarely do we orient towards the positive, but that's how the human mind works. We understand and we look for those things that are novel, those things that are out of place. So in this case, you did identify Dwight his intent was good. He wanted folks to be safe. His path there was awful. But we orient towards him doing the wrong thing to get them there and focus less on what went right. So when we think about developing character, developing young students, developing cadets, how do we capture those things that are going right? And so there's a great saying by Maslow, if you've heard of it, if the only tool you have is a hammer, you tend to see every problem as a nail. So if we miss those things that are going right, we fail to invest in them. So what you water grows in this case. So this is called strength spotting through positive psychology and Character Institute at Wake Forest is called strength spotting. And it's specific that when we engage in strength spotting, it's specific, it's highly specific. When we tell somebody good job, that's not actionable. Right. When we give feedback to students, to peers, to colleagues, to friends, to family, how specific are we? And how often do we identify or provide praise on something that's a value or a character, a facet of character? Thank you for doing the dishes, right? We've all probably said that at some point. What's the value or virtue or principle embedded in somebody doing the dishes for you, your partner doing the dishes for you? So an act of service, right? In this case, prioritizing you and your time over themselves, right? There's a layer of value, virtue, principle there that we often miss because we don't identify and we don't praise the value, virtue, principle. So how do we coach this? How do we help others understand this? So when folks come to us with an ethical dilemma, when somebody is trying to work through a problem, going back to those values. So you identified your top 1, 2, 3 values, shout them out. What were in the value sort? What you have? Honest? Integrity? Responsibility. Okay. So you come to me with an ethical dilemma, a problem, a decision you need to make. And we've identified that honesty is a value. My question back to you, rather than giving advice, because in counseling, we don't give advice. We help you understand what you need to do that you've already identified and empower you to do that. I would ask you, what would an honest person do in this situation? What would a person of integrity do in this situation? And for a young developing mind, and for a student, for a cadet, that's an important question to internalize a value of virtue and ethic, as opposed to me telling you what you should do. Because ideally, we want them to internalize these things. We don't want them to simply take what we've given them and then try to apply it. This is from a book by Baron Cohen. Yes, it is the cousin of Borat, researcher in England. Wonderful book. I'll show you here at the end. But in this process, in his research, he talks about good and evil. So how do we, actually, I'm going to go back. I skipped the most important part of that video. So now I want to reorient. So we know Dwight was trying to help, right? We know Dwight was trying to provide safety for individuals. Let's dive a little bit deeper. What positive aspects of virtue, character, principles, ethics did you see in that clip? We identified everything that went wrong. What went right in that clip? And so what value or virtue might Dwight be demonstrating there?
Caring for others.
Sure.
Maybe?
Yeah. Value for safety, caring for others, connection, perhaps.
Responsibility for their actions.
Sure. Okay. And maybe some responsibility in the role is like he's actually the fire marshal. So responsibility that he takes that job very seriously. And so insert intent versus act. And so this is also very, very important in helping develop ethical decision making. So when we think about young adults or even adults, and there's a decision and it doesn't go well. So in this case, Dwight's act wasn't great, but his intent was positive. If we only focus on the act, we miss the intent that's positive, which allows us a coachable opportunity to internalize that virtue, that value, and that decision making. So we have to disaggregate intent versus act. And that goes back to NASA. If we only hammer the act, we miss an opportunity to coach, and we miss an opportunity to coach those processes that are internalized. So, okay, insert good versus evil. And this is where empathy and neurological and biological processes play out in our ability to make ethical decisions, our ability to develop character. So this is a quote from Baron Cohen. Empathy occurs when we suspend our single-minded focus on attention and instead adopt a double-minded focus of attention. So we're tending to two different things here. And so now we see that values, virtues, principles influence our character, and we have to take this dual mindset in developing character and helping develop in leadership development. And so again, attention is the spotlight. So what we pay attention to grows. So if I'm working with a young adult, and maybe they, and CCLD folks know this, USAFA is called the Leadership Lab. It's a chance to try out leadership, a safe environment under supervision. So I may not make the best leadership decision, but what I pay attention to as that leader's leader helps that leader grow. So yes, their decision may not have gone as planned, but what I pay attention to is like, yeah, how'd that decision work out for you? How did that leadership decision work out for you? And it may not have worked out well. Well, what did you learn? Well, I learned that I prioritize people over myself, or I learned my intent was to take care of those I was leading. Okay, that's good. Let's spend some attention on that. You have a value, a virtue of service to others, of a duty ethic framework. Let's pay attention to that. Yeah, your decision didn't play out, but your other decisions will get better over time as you practice leadership. But that value, that virtue, what you intended, the intent behind that act is important. Let's coach that. Let's develop that. Let's talk about that. So attention is the spotlight. But again, we focus on what's missing, what's wrong. How many folks have young kids or have had young kids? Okay, your young kid's walking across the kitchen with a glass of milk. What do you say?
Be careful.
Okay, be careful. Yeah. And now be careful, don't spill it. Now, what is in that little kid's mind?
Spill it.
They're gonna spill it. Yeah. And so we all do it. Now, if we change that language to you're doing such a good job, you're being so safe. What's the internal message that kid's telling themselves now? I'm planning, I'm safe. I'm a people pleaser. Did somebody say people pleaser? And so we orient towards the negative often, and we do this even with children. And so I challenge you to think about that in your own lives. And this plays into something called the fundamental attribution error. And I'm seeing a lot of heads nod. Fundamental attribution error, for those that aren't familiar. If I am, as an example, if I showed up late today to come talk to you, what would you think of me? What would be your reaction if I showed up 15 minutes late?
You don't care.
I don't care. Okay, what else?
French.
I'm French. Or any other variety of cultures, right? What else? What else would you inconsiderate? Okay. So the fundamental attribution error is you ascribe this belief about me that one action informs my entire character. Now, in my mind, I showed up late, and I'm only thinking, I just hit every red light from Black Forest down to campus. That's not indicative of my character. Yeah, I could have done my time a little bit better, but we're all guilty of this at some point. I know this, I teach this, and I still do it every day. Somebody cuts me off on the interstate, they're a jerk, they're inconsiderate, they didn't see me, they have an F-850, they obviously prioritize themselves. It's all ego, right? None of that's right. For all I know, they're rushing to the hospital because they cut their hand, right? And so we're all guilty of this. And so what we pay attention to is a spotlight. And so often, as we're developing leaders, they're engaging in fundamental attribution error as well. So we have to catch that slippage. We have to coach them through that. So then empathy. So empathy, and this will come full circle here in a minute. So empathy, Baron Cohen says, functions on a scale. So we think of things as black and white, right? Often, either it's right or it's wrong, it's good or it's bad. You're empathetic or you're not. We know empathy functions on a scale through research. So you think of it as like a scale of 0 to 10, for example. And our ability to empathize is rooted in a number of things. So you insert epigenetics, which I'll talk about here in a second. But how we're raised, our environmental factors, things we're taught, things we observe informally, things we know through research. And so how do we coach empathy? And how does empathy play a role in values, virtues, principles, ethics, ethical decision-making, and leadership? Does anybody want a leader with 0 empathy? Okay. Does anybody want a leader with 100% empathy? Because what happens when you have a leader that is 100% empathetic and nothing else?
They don't end up bleeding.
They what?
They don't end up bleeding.
They don't have So we want a happy medium in our leaders, right? We don't want them to be unempathetic, but we don't want them to over prioritize that. We know that from high stress environments, from traumatic experiences in childhood, that increases cortisol in the brain, which actually decreases or shrinks the size of the hippocampus irreversibly. So traumatic experiences in childhood, higher stress hormones can shrink the hippocampus. And this actually increases reactive aggression. So I'm in a threat state, something happens to me, I'm more likely to react aggressively because of that shrunken hippocampus. And then we have an amygdala fear response, which inhibits our prefrontal cortex. And so what that means is we struggle to put the brakes on when we're in these high stress environments. I'm in a threat state, something's highly stressful. Maybe it's just in a meeting. I can't stop myself from saying something I'm going to regret, or making a decision at a high level of emotionality that I'm going to regret. As a side note, we also know that decision-making cannot be absent of emotion. When decision-making by a leader does not include some level of emotion, we fail to take into account those we're leading, and our actual decision-making is reduced. Our ability to make the right decision is reduced. So we are genetically predisposed to empathy. There are 10 regions of the brain we can measure under scanning that shows us levels of empathy. And we also know there are environmental factors here. So we are getting young leaders, perhaps, that may have been exposed to traumatic environments and are having these responses, not because of anything they're cognitively conscious of, but are environmental responses to how they're raised. So insert attention as a spotlight.
Does that imply that someone who's in a low stress environment has the ability to be more empathetic?
Potentially. It depends on what would be the initiating factor, right? So, we like to think in education, we all have a level of empathy because we're working with the next generation in some fashion or another. But if I'm not invested in it at the same level, I may not engage in empathy at the same level. We'll talk about that here in a second, but I'm less likely to engage in empathy with a stranger, somebody in an out group, than I am somebody that's identified as part of my in group. So even if I'm in a low stress environment. Okay, empathy erosion, we talk about this. What happens when we don't engage in empathy? Well, when we're not engaging in empathy and we have reduced empathy, it increases our likelihood of engaging in unethical decision-making, impermissible decision-making. So when we erode empathy, we see facets of resentment, revenge, hatred in our jobs. We also see this as cynicism. We become much more cynical when we're not engaging in empathy, and we start to turn others into objects. So there is a philosopher, Martin Buber, in the 1920s. So coming out of World War II, coming out of World War I, prior to World War II, he's an Austrian, and he came up with the concept of Ich und du. So me and you, or me and thou, is how it was phrased. And so when I hold you at the same level as me, I'm more likely to engage in empathy and treat you as part of my in-group and engage in some ethical, leadership decision making. When we turn folks into Ich und it, or what in German, in Austrian is Ich und es, we dehumanize individuals. We turn them into its. And so when we do that, we turn them into an out group, and we engage in less empathy, which increases our likelihood to engage in unethical decision making that marginalizes and takes advantage of that out group, the it, the s. And so on that scale of basically zero empathy to full empathy, Baron Cohen would say the only instances of zero negativity are things that are diagnosed, are things that we would see within the diagnostic statistic manual, and that we function on a scale of empathy. So how do environmental influences impact our ethical decision making, and how do environmental influences impact our levels of empathy? Is anybody familiar with the Dutch airport study from the 90s? So this actually has its roots dating back to the 60s. And so at the risk of losing half the room, for those that have seen a urinal before, aside from the urinal cake, what's in the middle of the urinal? Yeah, there's a little fly printed on the inside of most urinals. And so this came out of a series of not formal research studies, but it was basically a facilities manager at the Amsterdam International Airport that was trying to figure out how to reduce what was called spillage. And so they printed a fly, and in England it was a bee. They printed a fly in the middle of the urinal, and it reduced spillage by anywhere between 30 and 70%. And so that's would we say spillage is an ethical decision that you're making? maybe consciously, maybe subconsciously.
Very empathetic to the fly.
And so an environmental factor that is subconscious in nature, but it does something in your brain that allows us to make a better decision, right? And so it reduced that simply by placing a fly there. Then we have the Princeton Seminary study. This may be a study more folks are familiar with. So this is Princeton Seminary. They were trying to look at environmental factors that influence ethical decision-making. And so they had two treatments. The first is that the seminary students can, and mind you, these are people who are studying to be ministers, right? Okay, so people we would typically think are ethical and moral, and have moral alignment to their faith. On the whiteboard, when they showed up to their test, it said, the test room has been moved to across the campus and will resume in an hour. The other treatment was the test has been moved across campus and will be in 10 minutes. Okay, so now we created time as a variable. As the seminary students were leaving the classroom, outside of the class was Research Confederate, and they had spilled all their books, all their papers. And so the group that had only 10 minutes to get across campus, mind you, these are people who are about to be ministers, ran right by them. The minute there was an hour, almost all of them helped. The difference was 10% to 90%. And these are people who are going to be faith-based leaders. And the environmental factor, the only environmental factor was time. And that influenced what would be a virtue and value-based decision. And then the final one, everybody's generally familiar with Stanley Milgram, the shock experiments, right? Anybody not familiar with? Okay. So basically coming out of World War II, how do people engage in unethical decision-making coming out of World War II era Nazi Germany? And he was studying authority and different levels of authority. Disappointingly, however, this study has been replicated recently up within the last 6 years. And in Poland. This was replicated with the exact same results in Poland within the last 6 years. And was replicated in Norway as well. So we know authority or perceived authority also influences our ethical decision-making and when we're going to compromise our values and virtues and not engage in moral potency. So I'll ask you, and this will probably be where we wrap up, just like with a partner sitting next to you and I'll ask you to share out, what environmental cues do you see in your organization that may or may not increase or decrease ethical decision-making, either amongst yourselves or your students? So some of the group think is if everybody's jumping off the cliff, I'll jump off the cliff.
More of one acting in
Unilateral.
unilaterally or based on a certain decision based on their own thing without considering.
Okay. Larger scale. I heard of time, I heard tech.
Yeah, at the Air Force Academy, we see cadets, the longer they're there, they start to coagulate into their smaller groups, right? Whether it's a sport, a class, a academic major, or whatever. And I think that tends to reduce empathy with others, what we were talking about earlier. And the reduction in empathy changes behavior. And I think that they're a little more jaded by the time they graduate versus when they enter 4 years earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. And so when we think about empathy and coaching empathy and how that can be values-based, dehumanizing language is a slippery slope. And so this is something we need to catch in leadership development very early on. In reference to, I'll use the NARP example. That is one I hear often. So non-athletes. So at USAFA, you have, they're all cadets, but then you have athletes. And then you have what they're called non-athletes. And something that isn't necessarily initially derogatory does dehumanize and create as a slippery slope to other language that dehumanizes and extends that out group. The other one I'm thinking of, dually. Yeah, dually. I know that's a big debate up there. For those that aren't familiar, dually is what they're called when they're coming into the academy, presumably because they're serving dual roles as a basic cadet and then a fourth degree. Right? I'm capturing that generally, right?
Isn't it because it means slave?
Yes, it has a root in Latin as slave. And so the genesis of that term is not fully understood. And so some people are moving away from it, some aren't, but ultimately it's still used as a way to distinguish the upperclassmen from the underclassmen. And so dehumanizing language that's small and innocuous like that does have a slippery slope to more in-group, out-group, and moving away from our values. So
I love how that has evolved. I was at the Air Force Academy quite a while back, and it was always because it's slave. And now we found a more appropriate meaning for it.
correct.
I totally think that was invented.
Yeah, it's not, from my understanding, it's not dually like the truck. So there's two things, and I'm gonna skip ahead because we're short on time to do exactly this. So the first is, this is where the counseling component of counseling and leadership comes in. And there's a reason these classes are taught concurrently. So you're being taught to make leadership decisions, you're being taught to make command decisions. At the same time, you're tapping into your emotional response, through reflection, and self-understanding. So that's where these assessments come in. So if I do not have a strong emotional vocabulary and tapping my emotional vocabulary into my previous experiences, I'm never going to be able to do it with somebody else. The research on empathy is actually fascinating. If I've had the exact same experience as you, it actually makes me less likely to fully empathize with you. Now, if I haven't had the same experience, but I can relate to the emotion you're experiencing, it increases my likelihood of empathy with you. So tapping into the emotional core of those experiences. So one of my favorite questions to ask our AOCs and our AMTs is what resonated with you? How did that make you feel? And the response from the military is almost always good. Okay, those aren't feelings. Those are not feelings. And so it's as rudimentary as putting up a feelings wheel in the beginning of this response. So let's dive down into the core of what the actual feeling you're experiencing is. Let's name it and let's learn how to identify it in somebody else. So if I'm feeling guilt and I can identify that as guilt, and then I can use that as a leverage point to identify guilt in you, that increases my likelihood of empathy, of engaging in empathy. We don't do that. For those of you who are partners, friends, if you've ever sat through and listened to them complain or be upset about something and you give advice, or you tell them what to do, what's the general reaction? It's either 50-50 or it's not good, right? And so we engage in active listening, and rather than listening to speak and solve problems and give advice, we listen to help process. And so that forces us out of our own mind and their mind. So we would call this turning down the volume in our mind and turning up the volume in theirs. And so there's a couple ways, but there are some specific activities, and we'll close out on this. We're going to do a brief role play. This is very rudimentary. If everybody could just partner up. It's number 2. Your job is you are going to put yourself in the frame of mind of being from 1400 medieval Europe. Okay. 1400 medieval Europe. Number 2. So picture you're somewhere over there. Things are on fire. It's Monty Python and the Holy Grail. There's mud farmers. And pick a job. Pick a job that somebody would have in medieval Europe. Okay. Are we on it? Okay. Now think of an item, an object that you would use, utilize, see every day, something. Okay. Okay. So now, so now the goal is you're not gonna have to explain this, but you're in the frame of reference of a medieval peasant. Okay. Now number 1, you are present day, you are 2024. I want you to think of something. Don't pick cell phone because everybody always picks cell phone. Think of something that you have in your house, in your office, in your car, whatever. Think of something modern. Your task now, number 1, is to explain to number 2 this item in a way that somebody from 1400 medieval Europe would understand it. So if I had thought of cell phone, I'm not going to be able to say something you can call somebody on. Somebody from 1400 has no frame of reference for that. Okay? You can't say the word, but describe your modern item to the number 2s in a way that they would understand. And number 2's your job is to guess it. For those of you that were listening to this thing you didn't know, for those of you from medieval 1400s, how did it feel to sit there and have this described to you? Confusing. Okay.
Curious.
Okay, curious.
I wasn't confident.
Okay. Right, so lacking confidence. Yeah. Okay. Self-conscious. How about one more?
I would agree. I felt a little inferior, like, oh, she's got something I don't have, and I'm an idiot. Like the sun, I can relate to this.
Okay.
But other than that, like, ooh.
So you felt some power distance there. You were like, okay, this person might be an authority or I'm inferior. Okay. So in this experience, this is again very rudimentary. We're tasked with understanding the feeling of the person who may be frustrated, confused, lacking confidence. And so understanding this. So the folks from 2024, how did you feel watching your counterpart experience this?
I think I was more in my head about trying to describe the item
Okay.
and less about understanding where he was coming from.
Yeah, so you weren't able to suspend your own thinking and put yourself into his mind, right? Okay,
Like almost a little stressed.
okay.
Think about how do I describe this in a way that she could understand that wasn't
Sure.
and giving it full.
So you're putting pressure on yourself and not fully tapping into what she was experiencing.
Yeah.
Okay, so.
Well, I think that you have to think about what the other person, like, experiencing. So I picked water bottle, and I said the mechanism in which to carry water.
Okay.
But I think that, you know, in both situations, I can both understand both what a mechanism is to carry water and a water bottle. Now, if I chose what I was thinking of was like a Stanley, right? Because that's like a modern day cool thing.
Right.
Instead, and I like now with, you know, like if we had more time to say, you know, this mechanism is like, everybody wants your specific mechanism, like, you know, I think that that would be
Mm.
much more difficult. But thinking about like in a basic sense, now elevating it and putting, like a modern twist, like you have to think in both situations on it.
So, this is what kind of going where I hoped it was go. Now we're introducing, cultural understandings, right? We're understanding that, it's hard for me to empathize with somebody who is now perceived as my out group. From 1400, like that we have a time creating. So this is just something that there's variations of this. But when we're in a position of something like this, like leadership, we're in our own minds often, and we have to suspend the volume in our head and turn it up in other folks. And so that those are kind of one of two ways to help coach build empathy. So we start from a place of curiosity. You made that leadership. It didn't play out how you thought. How did that land with those you led? How did it land with those who impacted by it? Starting from a place of curiosity. Experiencing an inability to do something. Has anybody ever tried something that was so bad at it, you just gave it up? What else?
Art.
Art. What kind of art?
Any kind, really.
I'm not artistic myself, so I can empathize with being frustrated that my painting with the twists never turns out like the instructors. How about one more?
Learning Turkish.
Start, oh, geez. I think you can give yourself some grace there. Playing the banjo, like now it's a decoration. And so experiencing an inability to do something helps us empathize with somebody else who's struggling. As educators, as leaders, we are often not the students who struggle. Right? And so we struggle to empathize with students who are not as academically initially talented or gifted. And so we have to go back to times we struggled with an inability to do something to understand when those we're leading are struggling with the inability to do something. Role play activities. And even if stuff goes sideways, you can still draw attention to care for others. And so if I'm in my own head and I'm stressed about trying to make this leadership decision and I'm not turning up the volume in those I'm leading's head, I can reorient myself where I care for others that I'm leading. What does that entail? A person of integrity, an honest person would do what?